Nampa, Idaho, December 23, 2003. The morning air was crisp, the streets still, blanketed in frost. Most families were preparing for Christmas celebrations, but at one house the festive peace was about to shatter. Bob and Idella Young, an elderly couple known and loved throughout the town, were found brutally murdered in their home. Neighbors who came to check on them stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable violence. What could have led to such a horrific crime? Why would anyone target two people whose lives revolved around kindness and charity? Over the next 6 years, investigators would face dead ends, unanswered questions, and the sobering truth that the killer was someone closer than anyone could have imagined. This is the true story of Bob and Idella Young, a case where charity met a deadly end. Welcome to True Crime O'Clock. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to True Crime O'Clock for more true crime stories that uncover the human truths behind the headlines. Now, let's meet Bob and Idella Young, the couple whose lives and tragic deaths would haunt Nampa for years to come. Bob and Idella Young were pillars of the Nampa community. Known for their generosity and quiet compassion, they dedicated themselves to helping others, whether it was raising money for local schools, donating food to struggling families, or supporting those who had nowhere else to turn. The Youngs had built their life together on these values. Married for decades, they shared a deep sense of responsibility to give back to the town that had given them so much. They lived modestly, never flaunting their success. Their focus was always on service, helping those who needed it most. This earned them both admiration and trust. As Christmas 2003 approached, Bob and Idella were as busy as ever, preparing for one of their biggest charity projects of the year. But even in the midst of their work, they never missed community commitments. Which is why, when they failed to show up for a scheduled meeting on December 22nd, their absence raised immediate concern. It wasn't like them to be late or to ignore calls. Their friends and neighbors didn't yet realize that this small, uncharacteristic silence was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. If someone you trusted suddenly went silent, how long would it take before you acted? Share your thoughts below. The couple's dedication to charity had defined their lives, but it was also about to define the circumstances of their deaths. Coming up next, neighbors make a disturbing discovery that the town of Nampa would never forget. On the morning of December 23, 2003, neighbors grew increasingly worried. Bob and Idella Young hadn't answered phone calls or shown up for a scheduled meeting the previous evening. It wasn't like them to disappear without notice, and by now, that silence was impossible to ignore. When a neighbor finally looked inside, what she saw made her freeze. Bob and Idella were lying motionless on the living room floor. First responders quickly confirmed the worst. Bob and Idella Young had been brutally murdered. Blood spattered the walls, furniture lay overturned, evidence of a violent struggle. But there was something that didn't make sense. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Jewelry, electronics, everything was in its place. Even more puzzling, there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed that whoever had committed this act had been someone the Youngs trusted enough to let inside. Detectives knew they had a difficult case ahead of them. The absence of any clear motive or evidence trail would make finding the killer much harder than anyone expected. Word of the Youngs' deaths spread quickly. For a town that had seen them as symbols of kindness and safety, the reality of their murder was deeply unsettling. If you were investigating this case, what would be your first step? Let us know in the comments. With no immediate leads, police had to rely on forensic evidence and interviews to piece together what had happened. But even with their efforts, finding answers would be anything but simple. Coming up, investigators explore multiple theories, but the case takes a turn no one expected. With few immediate leads, investigators faced a difficult road ahead. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and the crime scene had left them more questions than answers. Detectives first considered the possibility of a failed robbery attempt, but the evidence didn't support it. Nothing had been stolen. Valuable items like jewelry, electronics, and cash were untouched. Was it a targeted attack? Perhaps someone with a personal vendetta. The Youngs were well liked, but detectives wondered if someone had secretly harbored resentment toward them. But interviews with friends and neighbors painted a consistent picture. Bob and Idella had no known enemies. People spoke of their kindness, their generosity. They couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt them. Despite the lack of suspects, detectives didn't stop digging. They re-examined everyone in the Young circle. Friends, acquaintances, even former tenants who had once stayed in the home. Over the next several weeks, detectives interviewed dozens of people. They chased down every lead, hoping that even a small clue might break the case open. But each potential lead fell apart under scrutiny. Alibis checked out. Fingerprints and DNA from the crime scene belonged only to the victims. Investigators were running out of options. As time passed without any breakthroughs, frustration began to mount. What had initially seemed like a solvable case was slipping further into uncertainty. Every avenue seemed to hit a dead end. Meanwhile, word of the murders had spread across Nampa. Residents, shaken by the crime, began locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. Fear and confusion filled the air as rumors circulated. Speculation ran rampant. Some residents believed the killer had already left town. Others suspected someone within the community itself. But with no new evidence, fear soon gave way to frustration. By early 2004, after months of exhaustive investigation, the case was officially declared cold. Detectives knew the killer was still out there, but without fresh leads, there was little more they could do. For more than 5 years, the murders of Bob and Idella Young would remain a mystery, until a routine event in 2008 would bring the investigation roaring back to life. If you were on the investigative team, what would your next move have been? Share your thoughts in the comments. Coming up, a twist in the investigation that would finally reveal the truth and the devastating betrayal behind the Youngs' tragic deaths. For more than 5 years, the investigation into the murders of Bob and Idella Young remained dormant. Detectives had exhausted every lead, and the case was left with no answers. But in 2008, everything changed. A routine traffic stop led officers to Pete Roberts, a man who had once rented a room from the Youngs. His name had appeared in early interviews, but without any evidence linking him to the crime, he was never considered a prime suspect. Until now, DNA collected during the stop matched samples found at the crime scene. This discovery reignited the investigation, and detectives now had a name to work with. Confronted with the evidence, Roberts eventually confessed. What he revealed painted a grim picture of resentment and desperation. Years earlier, Roberts had been going through financial difficulties. The Youngs had offered him a place to stay temporarily, but over time, his frustrations grew. He blamed the couple for not doing more to help him, resentment that festered until it turned into rage. On the night of the murders, Roberts confronted the Youngs, demanding financial support. The confrontation quickly turned violent. In a fit of anger, he attacked both Bob and Idella, leaving them to die in their own living room. The details of the crime horrified those who knew the couple. Many found it difficult to comprehend how someone they had once helped could turn on them so violently. The community was stunned by the betrayal. However, with Roberts now facing multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, the long journey toward justice was finally underway. With Roberts' confession and the DNA evidence in hand, prosecutors knew they had a strong case. But even as the trial approached, the scars of the crime remained raw for the Youngs family and the town of Nampa. Do you think the resentment Roberts felt was enough to drive him to such violence, or do you believe there was something else at play? Share your thoughts below. Coming up next, the trial of Pete Roberts brings long-awaited answers, but for the Youngs family, the pain of their loss remains. In February 2010, more than 6 years after the murders of Bob and Idella Young, Pete Roberts stood before a judge to receive his sentence. The courtroom was filled with friends, family, and members of the Nampa community, people who had waited years for this moment. The court sentenced Roberts to 2 life terms without parole. The finality of the judge's words echoed in the room. For the Youngs' loved ones, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, but it did not erase the grief. The judge said it well, Kathy shared. We have closure to this part of it, but the pain doesn't go away. We live with it every day. When given the opportunity to speak, Roberts expressed regret. I lost control, he said quietly. I hope both families can find peace. I am deeply sorry. Despite the sentencing, the scars left by the crime were deep. Bob and Idella had been more than just community figures. They were symbols of kindness and service. Their loss was felt by everyone who had known them. But instead of being defined by tragedy, their legacy lived on. Scholarships and charitable programs were established in their names, ensuring their spirit of compassion would continue to impact lives. What are your thoughts on the sentence Roberts received? Do you believe justice was served? Share your reflections in the comments. Up next, how the town of Nampa transformed its grief into action, ensuring that Bob and Idella's legacy would endure. The deaths of Bob and Idella Young shook Nampa to its core. Their absence left an irreplaceable void in the community they had served so selflessly. But in the face of overwhelming loss, the people of Nampa chose not to let fear and tragedy define them. Friends and neighbors honored their memory by continuing the work they had started. Scholarship programs were established to help underprivileged students. Charitable initiatives in the Young's name brought aid to countless families. Their lives were a testament to the power of generosity and compassion. But this case also underscored the importance of caution, even when helping others. The Young's trust had been exploited by someone they once gave shelter to, a harsh reminder that good intentions can carry unforeseen risks. In moving forward, Nampa learned to balance charity with awareness, finding ways to protect both those who give and those who receive. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? How can communities protect kindness without sacrificing safety? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The Young's legacy continues to inspire. Their story reminds us that even in the face of tragedy, acts of kindness have the power to endure. As long as their community remembers them, Bob and Idella Young will never truly be gone. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to True Crime O'Clock for more stories that honor the lives behind the headlines. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and stay compassionate.